The virus mutated on the last Thursday of October when the leaves turned blood red. The first changes were noticed in Berlin. In Berlin, a dead man stopped in the middle of the street and began to cry. Tears streamed down his grey face as he recalled his daughter's name. His daughter lived 3 blocks away, but he didn't know it. Zombies all over the world began to stop and look at the sky. The sky seemed familiar to them, as if they had seen it before in another life. Memories returned like shards of a broken mirror. Mirrors in abandoned houses reflected the dead, who suddenly recognized themselves. A woman in Tokyo saw her reflection and screamed. The scream was inhuman, but it carried the true pain of loss. She remembered her name now, Yuki, which meant snow in winter. That winter, she died from a bite while protecting her son from other zombies. Now Yuki searched for her child through the deserted streets of the metropolis. Megacities turned into labyrinths where the living hid from the dead. But the dead no longer wanted to prey on the survivors here. Something new was beginning to happen. Something incomprehensible even to the scientists in the bunkers. Zombies were gathering in groups and heading to the places of their former lives. The lives they had lost called them back with invisible threads of memory. In New York, a banker reached Wall Street in a tattered suit. The suit had once cost $3,000, but now it was covered in dried blood. The banker stood in front of the stock exchange building, weeping without dry tears. He stared dryly at the numbers on the display, which no longer changed. The cleaning lady who worked there stopped next to him. Here she spent her nights scrubbing the floors left behind by wealthy traders and brokers. Now the cleaner and the banker stood side by side, equals before death. Death made everyone equal, but memory made them different people inside again. The teacher from Cairo remembered his students and walked to the empty school. The empty schoolyard greeted him with silence, instead of the usual children's laughter. He entered the classroom and sat at the dust-covered teacher's desk. The textbooks he so loved reading to the children every day were covered in dust. The teacher took the chalk and began writing words on the board with a trembling hand. The words formed the final lesson he hadn't had time to impart to his children. Remember, knowledge is light in the darkness. He wrote crookedly, letters that were blurring as his hand began to decompose more rapidly. Doctors in the secure areas were noticing a strange new pattern among the dead. Memories brought new death. The more the zombies remembered, the faster they disappeared. In London, the mother found the house where the family had once lived. The family had long since evacuated, but her son's toys remained on the floor of the old living room. The mother picked up the teddy bear and hugged it to her chest, where her heart had stopped beating. The only echoes that remained were the memories of the lullabies she sang to the boy every night. Her body began to disintegrate right there, among the toys and photographs of happiness. Happiness no longer existed in a world divided between the living and the thinking dead. A soldier in Moscow remembered the promise he had made to his comrade before that last bite. The friend's last wish was to deliver a letter to his wife in distant St. Petersburg. The soldier walked across the country, clutching the envelope in his decaying hand. He made this promise his goal, even though he understood that every step was a waste of time. The chef in Paris reached his restaurant and lit the stove for the last time. Time after time, he prepared dishes that no one would ever eat again. His hands remembered every movement of the knife, every recipe from that past life. That life when guests applauded his art and critics wrote rave reviews. The chef fell to the kitchen floor after preparing his final masterpiece, dead. Dead, but content. He had finished what he had started in his youth. A pianist in Vienna found a concert hall and sat down at a dust-covered piano. The keys were covered in the dust of time, but her fingers remembered every note of the complex score. She played Chopin until the skin began to peel from her bones right there. Here, in the hall where hundreds once applauded her great talent, the music grew ever quieter until the last note dissolved into absolute silence. The zombies' devotion to their unfinished business from their past life was absolute. A writer in Buenos Aires reached for his battered old typewriter. He entrusted the last chapter of the novel he hadn't finished on time to the battered typewriter. His fingers tapped the keys more slowly with each word he wrote. Here was born the story of a love he hadn't had the chance to tell the world in his lifetime. The last period in the manuscript coincided with the last beat of his non-existent heart. Most of all, zombies gravitated toward their loved ones. Parents, children, loved ones. A gardener in Amsterdam came to the botanical garden where he had worked for 20 years. Every day he tended the rare orchids, which were now dying here without him. The gardener watered the flowers for the last time before his body slowly began to crumble into dust. Slowly but surely, memory killed those who dared to recall too many details. The artist in Prague reached her studio, where her unfinished canvases stood. The works of her life surrounded her. Portraits, landscapes, abstractions from various periods of his great career. She picked up a brush and put the finishing touches on the painting she was working on before her death. The first death and the second death. Between them, there was only memory and important unfinished business. A mechanic in Detroit returned to the garage where he had repaired his son's car before the apocalypse. The very same car that was supposed to be a 16th birthday present for his son. The mechanic tightened the last bolt, and the engine started perfectly on the first pull. The car was technically ready, but there was no one left in this world to drive it. The mechanic sat behind the wheel and closed his eyes forever, smiling for the first time in months of dead life. Afterlife offered a chance to complete what had been started, but in exchange, they took away existence itself entirely. A nurse in Mumbai recalled a patient she hadn't managed to administer medication to before being evacuated by that terrible force. On a terrible night, when the hospital turned into a hell of bites and screams of dying people everywhere, she found a pharmacy and got the necessary medications, even though she knew the patient was probably long dead. It may have been a meaningless gesture, but the nurse couldn't live dead without fulfilling her duty. The librarian in Edinburgh returned to the library and finally put the books back in their correct places. He finally and irrevocably restored the order that had been the meaning of his life for 30 years. Each book on its shelf was his small victory over the chaos of that world that collapsed, but left behind libraries full of humanity's accumulated knowledge. The librarian crumbled to dust between the shelves as he returned the last volume to its place. All the zombies, remembering who they were in the other's life, were searching for their place in the world. A firefighter in Sydney came to the station and cleaned the fire truck until it sparkled one last time. Time and again, he checked the equipment, even though no one was putting out fires anywhere anymore. It was a ritual that connected him to the past and gave meaning to the dead here. Here, among the helmets and hoses, he felt like a man again, with a clear, comprehensible purpose. The firefighter climbed into the cab of the truck and, for sure, never got up again. Thousands of zombies around the world did the same thing. They finished their business and vanished forever. A postman in Copenhagen delivered the last mail to their addresses, though the recipients were nowhere to be found. He'd grown so accustomed to his route over 30 years of serving as a faithful daily mail carrier. Letters remained in the mailboxes of empty houses, like messages from a forgotten world of the past. Forgotten, but not completely vanished. Memory kept it alive in the minds of the dead, thinking now. The postman collapsed on the porch of the last house on his long, long list of addresses. Whether it was a big city or a small village, there were zombies everywhere, remembering and dying again. A farmer in Iowa returned to his fields and planted the seeds of his last harvest, where his family had farmed the land for 5 generations without interruption, never before. The farmer knew he wouldn't see any shoots, but his hands planted out of good old habit. The land had always been kind to him, and he wanted to repay his debt before his final death. A priest in Jerusalem came to the temple and said a prayer for all the lost people of the world. The world was gone, but prayer rang out in the void, like the last hope of humanity. The priest prayed for the living and the dead, for sinners and the righteous, for all alike, without distinction. Differences between people no longer existed in the face of that terrible universal apocalypse. The priest dissolved into a ray of sunlight that filtered through the beautiful stained glass window of this ancient church. Only zombies with restored, now completely clear, memories possessed this ability to complete tasks. A taxi driver in Bangkok found his car and drove his last imaginary passenger somewhere far away, far beyond the city where he once dreamed of building a home for his beloved family. The taxi driver stopped at an empty plot of land and imagined the house he'd never built. Very soon his body turned to dust, carried by the wind over the same empty lot. The jeweler in Antwerp returned to his workshop and completed an engagement ring for his beloved bride. The woman he loved was no longer alive, but the ring had to be perfect. The jeweler set the last diamond, and his hands stopped moving forever, right then and there. The day the virus began mutating became a day of mass zombie pilgrimages to their former selves. An architect in Dubai visited the skyscraper he had spent 10 years designing as a successful zombie. He dedicated all his skill and talent to that tower, creating a unique masterpiece of modern architecture. The architect stood at the foot of the building and gazed upward until his eyes dimmed forever. The zombies became completely different after the mutation. They gained intelligence, but lost their immortality. A seamstress in Milan finished the dress she was working on for her last big fashion show. She'd been waiting her whole life for this great triumph, and now the dress was finished, flawlessly beautiful. The seamstress hung it on a mannequin and sat down in a chair, from which she never rose again. Not all zombies were seeking to complete their tasks. Some were simply searching for loved ones. A zombie child in Seoul found his parents' house and lay down on his small, soft child's bed. He hugged the stuffed animal close and closed his eyes, as if drifting off to eternal, peaceful sleep. His parents didn't know that their son was coming home for the last time, to say a very quiet goodbye. The zombies, having completed their work, died very quietly, without screams or that terrifying agony. A conductor in Vienna assembled an orchestra of zombie musicians for a final concert, theirs together. They were all united by a love of music, which they remembered even after the death of their first. They played Beethoven's symphony until, one by one, they crumbled to dust on that stage. That night, music rang out in the empty hall for the ghosts of a past and a future that didn't exist. The last note vanished into thin air along with the last musician of that dead, unique orchestra. Even scientists who had been studying the virus for years in secure labs didn't understand this unique phenomenon. A programmer in Silicon Valley completed the code for a program that was destined to change the world one day. He once believed in technology as humanity's salvation from all its great problems. The programmer pressed enter one last time, uploading the program to the now completely empty cloud. It seemed utterly pointless in a world without the internet or the same stable electricity as before. But the programmer fulfilled his duty to himself and vanished, dissolving into the air of the empty office. The survivors, watching from afar, saw no empty meaning in the zombies' actions. But for the dead, these actions were the last manifestation of their true humanity. They clung desperately to their former lives, knowing that memories were killing them again, forever and truly. A sculptor in Rome completed a statue he had been working on before that terrible epidemic that had suddenly begun. Suddenly, his hands regained their former dexterity, and the chisel moved confidently and precisely across the marble. The sculptor created his final work, a figure of a man reaching toward the high, distant light of heaven. Humanity's salvation from the virus that had transformed the world into a kingdom of the dead seemed far off. An astronomer in Chile climbed to the observatory's telescope and gazed at the stars for the last time, carefully and at length. He spent a long time studying space, dreaming of finding answers to humanity's eternal questions about the meaning of life. The astronomer saw the comet he had been searching for his entire life and died happily right at the eyepiece of his telescope. No one touched the telescope again after him. The observatory stood empty, a monument to human science. A dancer in Rio de Janeiro danced her last dance on the empty stage of her beloved home's theatre. The lights of her hometown went out, but she danced in the darkness to the music of her inner memory. The dancer spun until her legs gave out, and she fell softly like a wilted flower. Memory gently touched the zombie's consciousness, awakening the human element in that terrifying, rotting corpse. The judge in The Hague returned to the courtroom and delivered a just and fair verdict on himself. Honest to himself, he acknowledged all the mistakes he had made over his years of service to the cause of justice. The judge laid his robe on the table and disappeared, leaving behind only the last document he had written. The sentence, written in a trembling hand, read, "Guilty of abandoning humanity for the sake of the letter of the law." A fisherman in Norway set out to sea for the last time in his old, storm-battered boat. He was tossed about by the storms of life and death, but the sea called him back to its familiar waves. The fisherman cast his nets and caught a fish, which he released. He had no need of the catch. The catch was in the action itself, in returning to the work he had loved his entire life. The fisherman dissolved into the sea fog, becoming part of the elements to which he had once devoted himself entirely. The zombies devoted themselves entirely to their final tasks, ignoring the accelerated destruction of their own bodies. A veterinarian in Kenya came to the reserve and treated the last wounded animal, the only one left there. One baby elephant was left without a mother, and the veterinarian carefully bandaged its leg wound. The animal wasn't afraid of the dead man. It sensed the kindness in his last human actions. Humane acts became more and more common among the zombies, who remembered their happy past lives. The veterinarian petted the baby elephant one last time and lay down under a tree, where he was found only a week later. Only his bones remained, but the baby elephant survived thanks to his final act of kindness. A music teacher in Stockholm gathered the zombie children and gave them one last singing lesson together. Together they sang an old song about a home and family that no longer existed anywhere. Their voices were hoarse and uneven, but they rang with a longing for the lost life of that old life. The former innocence of childhood could never be regained, but the song gave them a moment of peace before the final end. The teacher and the children vanished simultaneously as the last note died away in the empty air of the hall. The living people in the shelters also didn't understand why zombies sought a second death, but the dead knew completing what they started was more important than an endless existence without purpose or meaning at all. In fact, the entire world had become a museum of unfinished business, which was now being completed one after another. A watchmaker in Switzerland repaired all the clocks in his workshop, and they began to run in perfect sync. At precisely midnight, all the clocks struck 12, and the clockmaker stopped forever then, too. His heart, which had not beaten, still measured out its final hour of the dead woman's life. No one who remembered escaped the same fate. Memory was both a gift and a curse here. A florist in Amsterdam composed a final bouquet of wilted flowers for the grave of his beloved wife. The woman he loved died a year before the epidemic, and he didn't have time to say goodbye to her. The florist placed a bouquet on her grave and lay down next to her, finally uniting with her forever. The virus's mutation finally and irrevocably changed the rules of this strange, unusual apocalypse. Zombies ceased to be a threat to the living. They became ghosts, completing the unfinished business they left behind. Then the survivors began to look upon the dead with compassion, rather than the fear they had before. They saw the zombies not as monsters, but as people who had been given one last chance to say goodbye properly and with dignity. Those who remembered themselves departed with dignity, without aggression or hatred towards the living who remained. An engineer in Shanghai launched the last bridge he designed before the collapse of the former, advanced civilization. His career had blossomed, but the bridge remained unfinished. Now he personally completed the work. The engineer walked the bridge from start to finish, carefully inspecting every structural element. A meticulously executed job had been his pride and the meaning of his existence for many years. The engineer stopped in the middle of the bridge and fell into the river, becoming part of that eternal natural flow. A mutation disrupted the natural order of things, but then restored it in its own strange, unusual way. A geologist in Iceland climbed the volcano he'd spent his life studying, a long and successful scientific endeavor. He dedicated his successful career to understanding the depths of the Earth and its mysteries, those infinite depths. The geologist took the last lava sample and recorded the data in a notebook that no one would ever read. Whether anyone would read these notes was unimportant. What mattered was completing the research begun back then. The geologist sat on the rim of the crater and gazed at the fiery lava until he became part of the volcano. He wasn't afraid of the volcano's ancient power. Death no longer existed for the already dead. An archaeologist in Egypt returned to excavations and found an artifact he'd been searching for 20 years. This discovery was crucial for understanding the ancient civilization that had long since vanished completely. The archaeologist carefully cleaned the artifact of sand and placed it in a prominent place for future generations. There might not be future generations, but the archaeologist believed in the continuation of that great human history. He crumbled into the sand next to the artifact, becoming part of the history he so loved to study. Studying the past helped us understand the present. Everyone who dedicated their lives to science and knowledge knew this. A chemist in Basel completed the formula for the medicine he had been working on before the outbreak of that terrible, horrible epidemic. The world could have avoided a terrible catastrophe if the cure had appeared those crucial months earlier. The chemist wrote the formula on a blackboard and left detailed, clear, and precise instructions for synthesizing the drug. Precise calculations were his passion and calling throughout his entire adult life, a scientific endeavor of great importance. The chemist closed his eyes in his laboratory, surrounded by flasks and formulas, his final theories. All zombies were driven by the same motives, the desire to finish what they started in normal life. A rescuer in the mountains of Nepal found the body of a climber an expedition had been searching for long ago. Back then, the rescuer had been unable to find the missing man due to a storm, and this tormented him for years afterward. Now he brought the body down and buried it according to all the rules of those experienced mountain climbers. He was an experienced rescuer, but one misfortune haunted him his entire life, right up until his first death. Now he had atoned for his guilt and could depart peacefully, disappearing into the pure, clear mountain air. The meaning of zombies' existence became clear to those who observed them attentively from the outside for a long time. They saw not monsters, but tragic figures of people completing the final chapters of their ordinary lives. A virus transformed ordinary people into undead, and the mutation gave them the chance to die with dignity and dignity. A sailor in Vladivostok repaired his ship and set out on his final solo voyage. His final voyage brought him to an island where he dreamed of building a house for a peaceful retirement. The sailor dropped anchor offshore and watched the sunset until it finally set forever. The era of the zombie apocalypse finally ended, when the last undead completed their important and personal work. The world became even emptier, but quieter and calmer without the hordes of mindless zombies of the past. Those who remembered themselves were no more. They had passed away, having completed what they had begun during their then ordinary lives. The remaining survivors emerged from their hiding places into a world filled with the unfinished business of those many strangers. Many stories remained unfinished, but the zombies completed theirs. It was their final gift to the dead world. Memory proved stronger than instincts and destruction, but it also became the key to the final death of the one. The very death that everyone deserves, a conscious and meaningful death, the last thing that matters. The world has changed forever after the mutation of a virus, a strange one that scientists still don't understand. No one knew what would happen next, but the story of the smart zombies remained as a reminder that humanity doesn't die with the body and lives on in bright memories.